Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Tonight, I invite you to travel back across centuries, to wine-swept hills of ancient Ireland, where smoke from autumn bonfires drifted into cold night air, where flickering lanterns made from hollowed turnips glowed softly against the dark, and where people believed, just for one night each year, that the worlds of the living and the dead drew close enough to touch. Long before carved pumpkins, costumes, or even the word Halloween existed, there were harvest fires, whispered prayers, and a deep reverence for the turning of the seasons. Tonight, we will follow the origins of this night, from the Celtic festival of Samhain to the Roman world, to medieval Europe, to the lamplit streets of early America, and into the modern celebration we know today. Before we begin, I'd love it if you could take a moment to comment where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Every night, this channel brings together people from all corners of the world, all quietly listening as they drift into rest. And it's always beautiful to see. Now make yourself as comfortable as you can. Your phone is silenced. The world outside can wait. From ancient bonfires to modern pumpkin-lit porches, this is the entire history of Halloween. How a night of fear, memory, and mystery became one of the most magical traditions on Earth. Let us begin with a world before Halloween had a name. The Celtic World, life before Halloween existed. For thousands of years before the word Halloween was ever spoken, long before pumpkins or costumes or trick-or-treating existed, there were people living intimately with the land. People whose entire understanding of life, time, death, and the divine was shaped by the slow, predictable turning of the natural world around them. To imagine their world, you must first imagine a life without clocks, without calendars, without electricity or streetlights. Daylight itself was a unit of time. The moment the sky began to soften from black to grey, life began. When darkness returned, life paused. They did not fight night. They accepted it. Fires were made not only for warmth, but to keep the unknown at a safe distance. Winter was not a season, but a force. Hunger was not an inconvenience, but a living, breathing threat. These were the Celtic peoples of ancient Ireland, Scotland, and parts of what is now France and Britain, though they would not have called themselves Celtic in the sense we do today. They were a network of tribal societies, agrarian and ritualistic, each deeply rooted in the rhythm of the earth. No two tribes were entirely the same, but they shared one thing absolutely: a way of life that could not be separated from the cycles of nature. Their year did not turn on arbitrary dates, but on elemental thresholds: light to dark, growth to decay, life to death. The year was divided into two great halves, the bright half and the dark half. Summer was not merely warm, it was alive, full of animals birthing, grains growing, sun stretching long into evening. Winter was not merely cold, it was dangerous, a time of frostbitten stillness, of hunger, of silence, of the unknown. It is important to understand that these people did not see time as linear. They saw it as circular, a great breathing, expanding and contracting, eternally renewing. There was no new year in the modern sense. There was only return, the return of light, the return of spring, the return of spirits. Existence was not a straight line forward. It was a circle, and everything was destined to come back around. Their spirituality, if we may even use that word, was not something separate from daily life. It was the air they breathed. The land itself was sentient. Hills were not just hills. They were the bodies of sleeping gods or ancient rulers. Rivers possessed spirits. Trees had memory. Stones held power. The natural world was not symbolic of the divine. It was the divine. There was no separation between the physical and the sacred. To live meant to be in constant relationship with unseen forces. Every action, Planting, harvesting, hunting, building was a conversation with powers both benevolent and dangerous. A good harvest was not simply the result of hard work, it was evidence of favor. A failed harvest, especially in the dark half of the year, could mean death. And death, to them, was not an ending. It was a crossing. By late autumn, as the last crops were gathered and animals were driven down from summer pastures, an awareness settled into the mind of every person. Soon, the veil would thin. But we have not yet arrived there. First, picture the height of their year, the long and golden summer, where work filled every hour of light. Fields grew heavy with barley and oats. Children helped gather berries from hedgerows. Cows grazed in fields rich with clover. Bees swarmed lazily around wildflowers. Meals were made from whatever could be gathered that day. Fresh milk, soft bread, maybe a haul of fish from a nearby river. There was music in evenings, flutes, drums, reed instruments, not to entertain, but to accompany life. Yet summer was not peaceful in a modern sense. It was labor, constant, exhausting labor, because they knew that every movement of the hand in summer was a direct mathematical investment in their survival through winter. The coming cold was not a possibility, it was a certainty, and it was respected like a god. Children were taught from birth to read nature the way we read words. The behavior of birds, the silence of forests, the smell of the wind. Knowledge was not written, it was inherited through ritual, repetition, and watchfulness. You learn not from books, but from bones, stars, seasons, and the expressions of the elders. In this world, community was not a luxury. It was the fabric of existence. No one survived alone. Grain was stored not for individuals, but for the tribe. If someone fell ill, every hand contributed to their survival. If a cow died unexpectedly, a catastrophic loss, it was treated not just as misfortune, but as a sign. Something had displeased the forces that governed the rhythm of life. Fear was not abstract. Fear had shape. It lived in forests, in abandoned fields, in the sound of branches creaking at night. Yet it was not the fear of monsters, but the awareness that life was fragile, and that balance with the unseen was essential. All of this, the relationship to land, the reverence for cycles, the ever-present nearness of the divine, formed the soil from which Halloween would one day grow. But in their world, it was not called Halloween. It was something older, something that marked not just the end of summer, but the dissolving of a boundary. And that moment belonged to a night called Samhain. We now step toward it. Samhain, the threshold between worlds. As the final days of autumn descended, something shifted in the air, slowly at first, so gradually that it was felt more than seen. The days grew shorter, almost imperceptibly at first. Dawn took longer to arrive. An unfamiliar chill began to linger in the mornings. The light of afternoon faded faster than it should have, and people who lived attuned to the breath of the land understood without needing to speak it aloud. Summer had died. This moment, this turning, was not saddening or celebratory. It was solemn, and it bore a name whispered with understanding rather than excitement. Samhain, pronounced Samhain, the ending of warmth, the beginning of descent. Samhain did not arrive on a precise clock-timed evening. It arrived when everything living began to recede from the surface of the world. Leaves fell, animals retreated, trees drew their lifeblood down into their roots. The natural world pulled inward. It was not death, but it was preparation for death, a drawing back, a beginning of silence. And with that silence came the returning of memory. Samhain belonged entirely to the dark half of the year. It was the boundary between what was seen and what was unseen. In summer, life was outward-facing, busy, bright, overflowing. But Samhain marked a reversal. People turned inward. Communities gathered close. Fires were built not for celebration, but for protection, and the living prepared to welcome and to be watched by the dead. To the Celtic mind, this world and the other world did not exist separately. They layered over one another like breath over a mirror, distinct yet inseparable. And during most of the year, the boundary between them remained firm. But during Samhain, that boundary thinned, not as metaphor, as fact. The dead were not gone. They were simply elsewhere. And on this night, they could find their way back. This was not imagined as malevolent. It was not conceived as horror. The dead were not zombies or demons. They were family. They were elders, once wise voices. Those who had walked the same fields and known the same hunger and wind and soil. To forget them would be a breach in the natural order. To remember them was to keep the world whole. Homes prepared for Samhain with seriousness. Doors were left unbolted. A place would be set at the table for ancestors who might return. A gesture of honor, not invitation. Food was left out on stone walls or hearth edges, not to bribe, but to acknowledge. We know you still walk somewhere. We will not pretend you are gone. But reverence was always tempered with caution. For not every presence that crossed the boundary was kindly. There were other spirits, older than memory. Guardians of wild places, watchers of forgotten borders. Beings not human and never having been human. Some tied to the soil itself, some to wind, illness, misfortune. Not evil, exactly, but dangerous if disrespected. During Samhain, they too were near, and so every action, every flame, every word spoken aloud, carried consequence. The world felt thinner. Villages fell quieter after dusk. The landscape itself was listened to. Dogs barked at nothing. Winds moved strangely, as though carrying whispers too soft for waking ears. Fires were the great anchor of Samhain. Enormous communal bonfires were built in high clearings, with wood specially chosen and ritually clean. Flames were not simply lit, they were born, sacredly, carefully, and every household would extinguish the fire in their own hearth earlier that evening, plunging the home into symbolic death. Only after the great communal flame had been ignited, blessed, watched, and judged, would people carry back its fire to relight their homes, ember by ember, carried in iron pots or hollowed turnips. A single shared flame for an entire people. A recalibration of the world. This was more than ceremony. It was power. To carry the Samhain flame was to carry protection. The fire was not a symbol of warmth. It was a barrier. Against what? Against whatever else walked in the dark. Samhain was not a single night of fear. It was an act of participation in the balance of worlds. The living did not try to command the unseen. They acknowledged it. They made space for it. They held fire not to defeat the dark, but to meet it with respect. Divination, the seeking of glimpses beyond the present, was common, but it was quiet, private, gentle. Apples placed in water, nuts thrown into hearth fire to read their crackling, mirrors darkened or covered, not out of superstition, but because reflection itself was believed to be a doorway. Nothing during Samhain was random. Everything had consequence. For this was the night when breath and silence stood closest to one another. And before morning returned, before the year could safely turn toward winter, a rite was always needed. The fire must be lit, the dead must be honored, the boundary must be acknowledged. Only then could the living step forward into the dark half of the year. And this is where the flames begin. Bonfires, druids, and ancient rituals. As darkness fully settled over the land and the last light of dusk faded from the horizon, people began to leave their homes and make their way toward the highest nearby hill, a place chosen not for convenience, but for visibility. The Samhain bonfire was not a private household ritual. It was a communal act performed under the open sky in direct and conscious view of the night. These were not small village fires. They were vast, prepared sometimes days in advance, their fuel gathered methodically, never taken from trees believed to house spirits, never cut in disrespectful haste. The wood itself had to be ritually pure. The fire was not permitted to be an accident of convenience. It had to be born correctly. A single spark born in error could make the entire ritual meaningless, or worse, dangerous. Oversight of this ceremony fell to the Druids, priests, philosophers, astronomers, healers, judges, keepers of laws and of cosmic rhythm. They did not write their knowledge down. Everything was carried in memory, in formula, in spoken precision. A single misstep, even in phrasing, could be believed to alter the spiritual alignment of the ritual. To the people, Druids were not magicians. They were harmonizers, humans capable of speaking to the invisible without offense, to stand between worlds safely. As everyone gathered in the great circle around the unlit pyre, there was no loudness, no festivity. Children were hushed. Even laughter, if it occurred, was softened quickly. Faces were illuminated only by faint moonlight. The air smelled of damp grass and soil, and a faint tension, not of fear, but of reverent anticipation, pressed upon the crowd. Then, the Druids began. Fire was not struck with flint. It was often drawn from friction, methodically and silently, summoned with patience. There was no spectacle. The moment the first flicker caught, when a pale orange pulse trembled into existence, all attention leaned forward, as if instinctively remembering some ancient rule. And then, the fire took, slowly at first, then rising, wood cracking, resin hissing, sparks bursting upward like tiny stars into the night. As the flames grew, heat rolled out across the gathering. Faces warmed, shadows shifted, and with that light came safety. The fire was a barrier, a beacon, a signal to whatever walked unseen that the living stood guarded, not to challenge, but to declare presence. This fire at Samhain was believed to protect the people through the coming winter. Cattle, their most precious source of survival, were often driven in slow procession around the fire, or even between two mirrored flames in certain regions, a ritual cleansing to remove illness, misfortune, or malice. Some accounts suggest that even people themselves, especially those considered vulnerable, walked near the flames to pass through purification. To step through a season without blessing was too dangerous to risk. The Druids cast offerings into the fire, grains, food, herbs, sometimes carved symbols or tokens, representing worries or illnesses to be burned away. Every crack and curling flame was watched for signs. The fire was an oracle as much as it was a shield. The longer it burned, the more it transformed the hilltop. It became a living thing, snarling, calm, rising, collapsing, whispering, roaring. People stared into it as if reading a language. Flames forked and twisted, shadows inhaled and exhaled. Embers floated upward to vanish into the black. This was the closest thing to witnessing divine presence, something between wild and ordered, between matter and spirit. No one rushed to speak. To stand in the glow of a Samhain fire was to exist for a moment outside ordinary life, suspended, held between seasons, between breathing and remembering. It was the single most significant moment of the year. From this flame, the fire of every home would soon be rekindled. Before that could happen, the Druids completed the closing of the rite. Prayers, not spoken as sermons, but as invocations, were given to honor both protection and surrender. For though Samhain was defensive in nature, it was never defiant. It acknowledged the right of spirit to pass through the world. It asked only for balance, for continued breath, for safe passage into the dark half of the year. And finally, as the fire stabilized into great breathing heat, something sacred occurred. People stepped forward to take its light. Some carried hollowed-out turnips or gourds, carved not decoratively but functionally, as vessels to cradle the living flame. Others carried metal or clay containers, carefully shielding embers inside. Each home would be relit from this one source, a single communal heartbeat of light. It was not symbolic. It was literal unity. One fire, many homes, many boundaries, but one night. From here, the night did not end. In many ways, it had only just begun. Ghosts, fair folk, and the ancient spirit realm. To understand what walked the world during Samhain, or what was believed to walk, we must step into the ancient Celtic understanding of spirit, which was not divided neatly into good or evil, or human versus non-human. The spirit realm was not imagined as a distant heaven or underworld. It was adjacent, interwoven, at times almost indistinguishable from the physical world, separated not by distance, but by veil. And during Samhain, that veil was at its thinnest. But what emerged through it was not imagined as cinematic or monstrous. The spirits of the dead, the ancestors, were often thought to be near throughout the year, but quiet, observing. Yet during Samhain, their attention could fall fully back upon their living kin. Doors were left unlatched, not to invite strangers, but to allow loved ones passage, if they wished it. Ghosts, to the Celtic imagination, were not cold apparitions of horror. They were simply people, not gone, only changed. Their return was not treated as spectacle. It was treated with careful normalcy. If a late ancestor returned, it was understood that they came not to frighten, but to witness, to watch over, to ensure the living had not forgotten the truth of mortality. Yet, it was not only human spirits that were near. There existed among the Celtic imagination a far older category of beings deeply tied to land and wildness, known in many later traditions as the fair folk. Not fair in the sense of gentle, nor fair in the sense of beauty, but fair in the sense of otherworldly equilibrium. Not angels, not demons, something else. They were not imagined as small or winged. That imagery came many centuries later. In ancient times, they were vast in mystery, powerful in ways neither cruel nor kind, bound not to moral codes, but to ancient laws of territory, exchange, and respect. These beings belonged to the She, not a fairy realm in the modern whimsical sense, but a parallel sovereignty tied to the hollow hills, rivers, mist-covered valleys, and ancient burial sites that dotted the landscape. Not metaphorical realms, but literal places, openings through which reality could breathe inward and outward. During Samhain, the boundaries at these she-mounds were believed to stir. Lights might be seen where no torches burned, slow-moving, like distant lanterns drifting across fields. Winds might shift in unnatural ways, sudden, sharp, directional. Animals might behave strangely. Milk might sour without cause. These were not taken as hauntings, but as reminders that this land was shared. The fair folk were not sought out during Samhain. They were avoided, not with fear, but with reverent caution. Paths believed to pass near their domains were not travelled after dark. Music was not played loudly near certain hills. Offerings, a portion of the harvest, a cup of mead, freshly baked bread, were placed on stone boundaries or under trees, not out of worship, but out of respect, a willingness to acknowledge, we know you are here, we walk gently. Even so, stories whispered among families spoke of travellers who crossed paths with otherworldly processions, glimpsed only in fragments, strange mournful music on the wind, horses whose hooves did not make sound, torches whose flames moved like water. These were not ghost stories. They were cautions. To look too long was to risk being seen in return, and being seen did not guarantee safe passage back. Spirit was everywhere, but it was not chaotic. Everything belonged to a rhythm. Samhain was not an explosion of supernatural terror. It was an alignment. The worlds were not colliding. They were meeting, just briefly, breathing into one another. What is remarkable and haunting in its own quiet way is how ordinary this acceptance was. Children grew up knowing not to shout near certain standing stones. Elders poured the first drop of ale to the earth before drinking. Travelers touched wood not to knock for luck, but to seek permission to pass. Every act was participation in a world shared, layered, alive. The unseen was not superstition, it was landscape. And during Samhain, that landscape opened its eyes. Not to dominate, not to terrorize, but simply to be present, seen or unseen, by whoever dared to notice. Rome arrives. Festivals of Pomona and Lemuria. Centuries passed, and across the sea, another world was rising. Vast, organized, iron-bound, carried on the discipline of legions and the ambition of emperors. When Rome expanded into Celtic lands, not all at once, but in gradual campaigns, it did not immediately erase the beliefs it encountered. Instead, it did something far more subtle and enduring. It absorbed. Rome did not conquer only by force. It conquered by integration. The Romans understood that rituals were not easily removed from a people, especially rituals tied to survival and seasonal rhythm. So rather than abolishing local observances, Rome wove them into its own festival calendar, aligning foreign rhythms to Roman ones, overlaying meaning rather than scraping it clean. By the time Roman influence touched Celtic lands, its culture had long been shaped by its own ancient relationship with the dead, a relationship that carried not fear, but obligation. Roman families believed deeply in the continuity of lineage, both bloodline and spiritual presence, and two of their most significant rituals bore striking resonance with Samhain, though born from entirely different soil. The first was Pomona, a Roman festival honoring the goddess of orchards, fruit, and abundance. Unlike the solemnity of Samhain, Pomona carried a tone of gentle celebration. It took place in late autumn, coinciding with the final dropping of ripe fruit, apples, pears, figs. It was not about the dead, but about the last sweetness of the living earth, the tender final offering before dormancy. Pomona was represented with fruit in hand, often an apple, a symbol not yet tied to temptation or sin, but simply to completion, to ripeness, to a season fulfilled. In Roman thought, the apple was not ominous, but comforting, a final warmth before winter. And it is here, in the simplest vision of fruit suspended in water, children laughing as they tried to catch apples by mouth, that we glimpse the earliest seed of a tradition that would one day drift into Halloween. But Rome had another autumn ritual, one not sweet, but still and grave. Lemuria, held in May, long before any modern association with spring or renewal. Lemuria was a night for the restless dead, not honored ancestors, those already at peace, but the unquiet ones, spirits who had died violently, prematurely, or without proper rites. Romans believed such souls could linger, agitated in the realm of the living unless they were formally released. The rites of Lemuria were not festive. They were performed in silence, by the head of the household, barefoot, without turning back. At midnight, he would walk through the house, throwing black beans over his shoulder, reciting an incantation meaning, essentially, "With these gifts I redeem me and mine." The beans, symbolic of souls, were believed to draw the attention of the spirits. The living would not look back until the ritual was complete. It was not a plea, it was a settlement. What mattered was peaceful separation. And so when Rome met the Celtic observance of Samhain, its solemnity, its quiet attention to the dead, its awareness of a thinning boundary. There was recognition, not of sameness, but of compatibility. Both cultures believed that the end of one cycle and the beginning of another required ritual acknowledgement of those no longer living, and intercession to maintain balance. Rome did not erase Samhain. It adjusted it, timed it, slowly tethered it to its own calendar logic. Festivals began to blend not in open declaration, but in quiet equivalence. The honoring of Pomona's fruit was absorbed without conflict into the Celtic harvest context. Apples began to appear not just as offerings, but as objects of seasonal divination, not playful at first, but serious. The sweetness of a fruit was not merely nourishment, but prophecy. And though Lemuria belonged to spring, its method, its acknowledgement of unrested souls, found silent familiarity in the shadowed night of Samhain. Eventually, over generations, with intermarriage, trade, diplomacy, and the slow flow of culture across the island, the two cosmologies began to overlap, not as one replacing the other, but as two rivers running side by side, occasionally crossing, occasionally pulling fragments from one another. Apples floated in water, not only for nourishment, but for messages, signs of love, fortune, coming change. The dead were not feared, but neither were they forgotten. And without anyone knowing, the future skeleton of Halloween, apples, spirits, prophecy, ritual fires, was being quietly assembled, still unnamed, still unself-conscious, a tradition being built not deliberately, but organically, carried forward by each turning of the year, the Christian Church and the birth of All Saints' Day. As the centuries moved onward, another influence began to ripple across the Celtic world, one that would not arrive by fire or hilltop ritual, but through quiet, pervasive shifts in belief and practice. The Christian Church, slowly spreading through the islands, carried a worldview that sought to codify the unseen, to categorize the spiritual, and to establish a structured calendar of holy days. Yet, in its early efforts to convert the native peoples, the Church faced a remarkable challenge. It could not simply erase the rituals that had survived for generations, for they were woven into daily life, survival, and community identity. To confront them directly was to risk alienation. Instead, the Church chose a path of integration. It did not abolish Samhain. It did not destroy the fires or forbid the offerings to ancestors. It simply reframed them, giving the celebrations a new layer of meaning that aligned with Christian cosmology. Where there had once been the recognition of spirits wandering freely, there would now be saints and martyrs honored. Where there had been thresholds between living and dead, there would be designated feast days marking holy intercession. By the 8th century, Pope Gregory III formally designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, a day to honor all saints, both known and unknown. It was sometimes called All Hallows' Day, and the evening before naturally became All Hallows' Eve. But this was not the violent replacement of old customs. It was a subtle merging. The timing corresponded closely with the seasonal markers already celebrated by the Celts. The end of the harvest and the drawing in of light and warmth from the land coincided perfectly with the Church's newly designated observance. For ordinary people, the transition may have been nearly imperceptible. They continued to light fires, to leave offerings, to carve protective symbols. The Church did not demand the cessation of these acts, only that the purpose be redirected toward the saints. What had been gestures of protection from wandering ancestors became prayers for intercession. What had been divinatory apple rituals, or the honoring of spirits, became acts of piety and remembrance within a Christian framework. This adaptation was crucial for both parties. For the Church, it allowed the new religion to take root without alienating a population deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature. For the local people, it preserved the practical and spiritual functions of their rituals. Fire still protected, offerings still marked continuity, and the community still gathered at the turning of the seasons. The essence remained, even if the language had changed. Even within this shift, the essence of threshold and transition persisted. Samhain had always been a liminal time, a moment when boundaries thinned, when life and death, the living and the unseen, coexisted more closely than at any other point in the year. The church's reframing did not remove this liminality. It merely shifted the lens. Where once ancestors might walk freely among the living, now the community invoked the protection of saints and angels. The night was still charged, still marked with ritual, still a pause in ordinary time. Over time, new customs naturally arose around All Hallows' Eve. People began to hold vigils in churchyards, to light candles not only on altars but on windowsills, symbolizing both remembrance and guidance. Bells tolled not to call the spirits but to honor the sacred. Stories of miracles and saintly intervention circulated, taking the place of some older ghost tales while maintaining the same psychological function. A gentle acknowledgement that the unseen world influenced the lives of the living. In rural villages, however, the line between old and new remained beautifully blurred. A fire might still be lit on a hill, apples floated in water, and offerings were left near thresholds, now framed as dedications to saints rather than ancestors. Children might dress in simple disguises or masks, not yet as trick-or-treaters, but as participants in the community's ritual acknowledgement of the sacred night. The spiritual weight of Samhain persisted, now entwined with Christian ideas of sanctity, piety, and divine order. It is in this period that we see the true continuity of the Halloween tradition. It was never about conquest or replacement, but about adaptation and survival of ritual meaning. Ancient beliefs did not vanish. They evolved, guided by new theology, yet remaining grounded in the natural cycles, in seasonal awareness, and in the human need to honor the living and the dead. By merging the old with the new, the church ensured that the rhythms of community, fire, and nighttime observance remained intact. The celebrations retained their quiet solemnity, their acknowledgement of liminal time, and their central function as markers of passage, from harvest to winter, from life to death, from one year to the next. Thus, All Hallows' Day and its eve became not a break with the past, but a continuation in a different form, a sacred bridge connecting generations of human experience across centuries. The cycle endured, transformed but unbroken, preparing the stage for the customs that would travel across oceans and centuries, ultimately shaping the Halloween that the world would come to recognize long, long after the Celtic fires had dimmed. Medieval Europe and the soul cakes tradition. As centuries continued to unfold, the echoes of Samhain and All Hallows' Day traveled through the shifting landscapes of medieval Europe, transforming once more under the rhythms of village life, ecclesiastical influence, and emerging social structures. By this time, the church's observances had spread widely, and communities had woven together layers of ancestral memory, Christian ritual, and localized custom. It was a world in which life remained intimately bound to the seasons, but now threaded with new, tangible practices, some simple, some profoundly symbolic. One of the most enduring traditions to emerge in this period was the practice of souling, a quiet, deeply reflective ritual that would leave traces visible even today. In early November, particularly on All Hallows' Eve and All Souls' Day, children and the poor would move from house to house, carrying small cakes shaped or marked in particular ways, soul cakes, and offering prayers for the souls of the departed in exchange. It was not candy for fun, as it would later become, but a means of spiritual reciprocity, a gentle negotiation between the living and the dead. The soul cakes themselves were humble, simple breads or pastries, sometimes marked with crosses to signify their sacred purpose. Each one represented a soul, each one a prayer. To receive a cake meant one would commit to remembering a soul in prayer, to intercede on its behalf as it traveled toward peace. These were acts performed quietly, without fanfare, in candlelit homes that smelled faintly of bread, smoke, and the lingering chill of autumn air. Children, sometimes carrying small lanterns, moved softly through the streets, calling out the names of the departed, or offering short, repeated prayers. The practice was never meant to be loud or chaotic. Bells might toll in the village church or at nearby crossroads, adding a measured rhythm to the night, signaling not alarm, but presence, continuity, and communal attention to mortality. Through this ritual, communities collectively acknowledge the thin veil between worlds, without dramatization or fright. The poor and the young, the widowed and the solitary, all participated, ensuring that no soul was forgotten and that every family engaged in acts of remembrance. In this way, the living were linked to the dead through tangible, tactile practices: bread, candlelight, song, and prayer. These rituals were also deeply connected to the cycles of labor and harvest. November marked the turning of the year, the first chill of approaching winter, and the time when communities gathered closely around fires, not only for warmth, but to reassert bonds of memory and obligation. The act of giving or receiving a soul cake was not mere charity, it was ritualized care, a confirmation of one's place in both the physical and spiritual fabric of the village. The spiritual significance was reinforced in homes and churches alike. Families would light candles and set them in windows or along the edges of hearths, not as decoration, but as guides for wandering souls. In some regions, it was believed that spirits could be soothed or directed with the soft glow of candlelight, helping them find rest and easing their passage to the other world. These lights, faint and steady, mirrored the communal fires of ancient Samhain, now scaled to the intimacy of the household rather than the hilltop. Souling also reflected the medieval preoccupation with the interconnectedness of life and death, a belief that neither could be understood in isolation. The living owed attention and care to the dead, and the dead, in return, lent guidance, protection, or at least acknowledgement. Houses that neglected these rituals were believed to risk imbalance, a sense that misfortune or ill health could slip silently into the household, not as punishment, but as consequence for ignoring the natural rhythm of acknowledgement. By this period, the practices of All Hallows' Eve had also begun to include subtle forms of playful disguise and performance, though these were far from the costumes we know today. Simple masks, hooded garments, or symbolic coverings allowed participants to represent spirits or embody liminal figures blurring the boundary between the living and the unseen. It was not entertainment in a modern sense. It was a reflection of presence in the other world, a humble recognition that humans and spirits coexisted along a continuum that demanded care, attention, and respect. Through these quiet acts, the offering of a small cake, the tolling of bells, the soft glow of candlelight, the people of medieval Europe preserved the core essence of Samhain, even as it was reframed through Christian observances. They maintained a connection to the turning year, to the ancestors, and to the unseen forces that shaped daily life. The night was neither fearful nor chaotic. It was measured, intentional, and enveloped in a calm, reflective awe. In this way, All Hallows' Eve became more than a calendar date. It was a temporal anchor, a shared night in which communities, young and old, poor and rich, engaged in practices that reaffirmed their place in the world. The living alongside the departed, the material alongside the spiritual, the momentary alongside the eternal. The rhythm of bread, candlelight, and whispered prayers would carry forward, quietly forming the foundation for future celebrations, even as Europe itself continued to change in unpredictable and sweeping ways. And so, on these medieval streets and in these softly lit homes, the night of remembrance continued, a night in which the veil was thin, the spirits acknowledged, and the living reminded of the eternal circle of life, death, and memory. Witches, cats, and folklore of the Middle Ages. As the Middle Ages deepened across Europe, the quiet rhythms of seasonal observance continued. Yet the human imagination began to weave layers of narrative around the unseen, blending old beliefs with emerging superstitions. Life remained closely tied to the land, but now the night held not only the presence of ancestors or saintly intercession, but also the possibility of beings both mysterious and morally ambiguous. These were not monsters in the sense of stories told to frighten children. They were figures who inhabited liminal spaces, thresholds of morality, fate, and natural law, and who demanded attention, respect, and caution. Central among these figures were witches. In the medieval imagination, witches were rarely caricatures of horror. They were often healers, midwives, and keepers of secret knowledge, women who understood herbs, the cycles of the moon, and the movements of the stars. Their power was subtle, rooted in observation and timing, in careful attention to the forces around them. The very same practices that protected crops, aided healing, or ensured fertility in one generation could be construed as witchcraft in another. Stories of witches walking at twilight or gathering under moonlight persisted throughout villages, whispered in quiet corners and across hearths. Moonlight lanes, narrow paths flanked by hedgerows whose shadows twisted and flickered, were both practical roads and symbolic spaces, believed to be channels through which unseen forces moved. A traveller passing under a full moon might leave offerings at crossroads or touch wood to ensure safe passage. These were not acts of fear, but ritualized caution, ways to acknowledge the presence of forces that were neither fully visible nor entirely comprehensible. Animals became symbols and companions in this web of belief. Cats, particularly black ones, were often associated with witches, not because they were evil, but because they were perceived as connected to the other world. A cat moving silently through a village at night could represent intuition, independence, or the presence of a hidden mind. They were observers, not participants, yet their presence was treated with care and respect. Crows, owls, and foxes also carried layered meanings, signaling omens or acting as messengers between realms. Nature itself, as in older Celtic times, remained alive with communication, and humans had to learn to interpret the signs. In rural areas, villagers developed rituals to negotiate these uncertainties. Crossroads became liminal spaces, places where decisions carried symbolic weight, where offerings could be left, and where invisible agreements were silently honored. Small charms were carried, herbs were hung in windows, and spoken words, sometimes in incantations, sometimes prayers, were repeated to align oneself with the proper balance of forces. These customs were not intended to invoke terror. They were acts of quiet mindfulness, ways to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature and the unseen world. Folklore of the period often intertwined moral lessons with explanations of the unknown. Ghostly figures might appear to warn, guide, or rebuke rather than harm. Tales of women who could read the signs of the wind, heal a sick child, or predict the weather reflected a deep respect for knowledge beyond ordinary perception. People understood that the world was more layered than could be seen with the eye alone. A misstep in timing, a failure to acknowledge the unseen, could bring misfortune, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of disharmony. Samhain and All Hallows' Eve, now fully integrated into Christian calendars, carried these superstitions forward in subtle ways. Villagers lit lanterns or placed candles at windows, not only to honor the dead, but to ward off wandering spirits and mischief, human or otherwise. Masks and disguises were sometimes used to protect the wearer from being recognized by spirits, or to confuse tricksters, a practice that would evolve over centuries into the playful costumes we know today. Moonlit nights during this season were especially significant. The full moon, drifting across frosted fields or shining between skeletal branches, cast the world in sharp relief. Shadows lengthened and twisted. Animals moved with quiet precision. Paths were illuminated, yet transformed. It was a world simultaneously familiar and charged with possibility. Villagers learned to read it, intuit it, and move through it with care. Even the softest sound, a door creaking, a branch snapping, the low hiss of wind, was taken as a signal to pause, observe, and respect the balance between seen and unseen. The symbolism of witches, cats, and folklore in the Middle Ages was not designed to terrify. It was designed to teach attention, respect, and awareness. Life was unpredictable, mortality was near, and the world beyond the immediate could influence the living at any moment. By personifying aspects of uncertainty through witches, spirits, and symbolic animals, communities created a framework to navigate both the natural and supernatural order. By moving through moonlit lanes, carrying small charms, offering prayers, and observing omens, people engaged with a living folklore that connected them to generations before them and the mysterious rhythms of the land. It was an existence that embraced wonder, accepted danger, and honored the delicate balance between curiosity and caution. A quiet, reflective, and immersive interaction with a world much larger than the visible one. Through these beliefs and practices, medieval Europe preserved an essential quality of the Samhain night, a threshold experience where the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted, and where attentive observation, ritualized respect, and subtle interaction maintained harmony between worlds. This tradition of quiet vigilance, reverent curiosity, and symbolic understanding would continue to evolve, carrying forward the ancient awareness that the night itself was alive with meaning. Ireland, Scotland, and the evolution of the jack-o'-lantern. In the misty hills and rolling plains of Ireland and Scotland, the customs of Samhain persisted long after the initial arrival of Christianity, blending seamlessly with medieval practices and local folklore. It was here, amid stone walls and peat smoke mornings, that one of the most enduring symbols of the season first took form. The jack-o'-lantern. Though in its earliest incarnations, it bore little resemblance to the pumpkin faces familiar today. The tradition began with turnips and other root vegetables, carefully hollowed and carved with simple, sometimes crude faces. The act was not intended to frighten children or amuse the living. It had a solemn, protective purpose. Carved turnips were placed near doorways and windows, their flickering candlelight casting gentle shadows across the rough stone of cottages, signaling a kind of watchfulness. They were meant to guide wandering spirits, both ancestor and stranger, safely past, offering light to those who might otherwise stumble in darkness. The earliest stories surrounding these lanterns were tied to the figure of Stingy Jack, a cunning man who tricked both the devil and the angels. When he died, denied entry to both heaven and hell, he was condemned to wander the earth with only a carved turnip to light his path. This tale was neither horrifying nor humorous in its original telling. It was a morality story, a quiet reflection on the consequences of one's actions, a recognition of life's tenuous balance, and an explanation for the glowing faces that flickered in windows during the long, dark nights of early November. The lanterns themselves became portable symbols of liminality, a way for the living to participate in the subtle negotiations between worlds. Families would carve faces with varying expressions, some serene, some wary, representing not the grotesque, but the spectrum of presence, the benevolent, the watchful, the wandering. The act of carving was deliberate, often a communal undertaking, sometimes accompanied by whispered prayers, blessings, or small offerings placed inside the hollowed root. It was a reminder that light, however small, could hold a place of comfort and protection in the midst of encroaching darkness. As these customs evolved, they were closely tied to the belief in wandering spirits. It was thought that during Samhain, souls traveled more freely, not only ancestors, but also other beings, spirits who had unfinished business, restless wanderers, or even mischievous fair folk moving through the night. The lanterns acted as gentle beacons, allowing spirits to find their way without causing harm, and letting the living maintain the boundaries of their homes and hearths. The light of a turnip lantern was never threatening. It was guiding, respectful, and quietly magical. Communities developed subtle variations. In some areas, the lanterns were left on windowsills, in others near threshold stones. The carved faces could be simple incisions or elaborate, reflecting the care and attention of the household. Children learned early that this was a season of preparation and mindfulness, when actions mattered not only for the living, but also for those invisible presences that walked just beyond ordinary perception. Even the choice of vegetable carried meaning. Turnips were hardy, available through the chill of early winter, and rooted in the earth, a tangible connection to the soil and the cycle of harvest. They embodied resilience, practicality, and the quiet acknowledgement of the season's shift from abundance to scarcity. In their hollowed forms, they became containers of light, memory, and intention, bridging the material world and the spiritual realm. By the time these traditions had solidified, the jack-o'-lantern was both protective and symbolic, a nightly reminder that Samhain was not simply about fear or the supernatural, but about awareness, respect, and active engagement with unseen forces. The soft glow of a lantern served as a visual rhythm for the night, a signal of care, a gesture of hospitality towards spirits, and a recognition of the fragile boundary between living and departed, between here and elsewhere. Through generations, as families carved lanterns and children learned the stories of wandering souls and clever tricksters, the practice became deeply embedded in the culture of Ireland and Scotland. It was more than decoration. It was a living dialogue with the past, the dead, and the cycles of the land itself. It reminded the living that even in darkness, light could be carried, intention could be shaped, and connection could endure. In this way, the jack-o'-lantern evolved as a gentle symbol, one that illuminated not just doors and windows, but the understanding that the night, the unseen, and the living could coexist with quiet reverence, and that human hands, through a simple act of carving, could participate in the ancient rhythm of guidance, remembrance, and protection. Early Halloween nights in the British Isles. As Samhain traditions continued to weave their way through Ireland, Scotland, and the wider British Isles, the night of All Hallows' Eve came to hold a unique intimacy, a time when communities and individuals alike engaged in rituals that combined reflection, play, and quiet divination. While the large bonfires and jack-o'-lanterns marked protection and guidance, there existed a subtler layer of practice, focused on insight, fate, and personal fortune, especially among young people preparing for the coming winter months. One of the most pervasive activities of these early Halloween nights was divination related to love and destiny. Young women and men on the cusp of adulthood saw the thinning of the veil between worlds not only as a time to honor the dead, but as an opportunity to glimpse the future. The night was considered auspicious for discerning who might marry whom, who might travel, or who might endure hardship in the year to come. Unlike playful modern practices, these rituals were performed with careful attention, and often in hushed rooms illuminated by candlelight, the flickering flame lending both focus and mystery. Mirror rituals were among the most common forms of fortune-telling. A young woman, perhaps standing alone in a quiet chamber, might hold a mirror and gaze into its reflective surface, sometimes with only a single candle behind her. The mirror was thought to reveal not mere appearances, but glimpses of a coming spouse or partner, a shape or figure that hinted at the nature of her future. Such rituals were performed quietly, deliberately, and with a seriousness that belied modern amusement, and they required patience and reverence. Many also used water-filled basins to achieve a similar effect, peering into the ripples as a portal to possibility. Other customs involved apple-based divination, practice that carried echoes of Roman and Celtic blending. Apples, sometimes peeled in a single long spiral, were tossed over the shoulder, and the pattern or shape of the peel as it landed could indicate the first letter of a future lover's name. Sometimes two people might participate together, each interpreting the shape as a sign of compatibility, alignment, or potential obstacles. These acts were rituals of engagement with the unseen, a dialogue between intention, chance, and the subtle currents of the night. Community gatherings also took place, particularly in smaller villages where songs, games, and dances were woven into the evening. These were not loud or rowdy celebrations. They were softly social, structured, and layered with symbolic meaning. Participants often moved in ways designed to honor both ancestors and natural cycles, sometimes encircling fires, sometimes walking along moonlit paths, or singing quietly in candlelit halls. Through these actions, they enacted the rhythm of the night, acknowledging the presence of spirits, the passage of the year, and the forces that shaped human life and connection. Some households engaged in predictive rituals, using household objects, rings, nuts, or small tokens, dropping them into water or carrying them in a specific sequence to divine outcomes for love, health, or fortune. These practices were often shared across generations, passed from mother to daughter or father to son, quietly maintained as a form of knowledge about both the physical and spiritual world. In each case, the act of prediction was embedded in respect for unseen forces, a practice meant to harmonize the human experience with the natural and spiritual rhythms of the season. The night was also a time for gentle courtship and communal play, always tied to the liminal quality of Samhain. Young people might exchange small gifts, write names on pieces of bark or parchment, or participate in dances designed to bring them into alignment with their future paths. All actions were imbued with subtle meaning, a smile, a glance, a gesture interpreted as a signal of favor, destiny, or caution. The night allowed for exploration of human relationships within a frame of ritualized structure, reinforcing both community bonds and personal reflection. Throughout these practices, candlelight, moonlight, and shadow played a central role. Soft illumination guided the eye and imagination, marking thresholds between reality and possibility. Shadows cast across walls and floors reminded participants of the night's liminal character. The moment between seasons, the edge of the year, the fine line between what is known and what is revealed only in whispers. The quiet presence of the past and the unseen was acknowledged, but never dramatized. The night was contemplative, reflective, and subtly magical, a space in which the living engaged consciously with the mysteries of life, love, and mortality. Early Halloween nights in the British Isles, then, were an intricate blend of protection, observation, and reflection. Bonfires, lanterns, and symbols marked physical and spiritual safety, while mirrors, apples, and playful divination invited glimpses of future possibilities. The night was not meant to frighten. It was meant to teach attentiveness, patience, and reverence. Families, neighbors, and friends participated in layers of tradition, ensuring that the turning of the year was acknowledged, honored, and prepared for, all while the unseen world remained present, observed, and quietly respected. Through these customs, Samhain maintained its role as a threshold of insight, preparation, and reflection, blending communal ritual with personal contemplation, and embedding the night with a depth of meaning that would ripple forward through centuries, shaping the essence of Halloween as a time for both remembrance and quiet wonder. Halloween crosses the Atlantic. By the 17th and 18th centuries, waves of immigrants began to leave the British Isles, carrying with them the layered customs of Samhain and All Hallows' Eve. Ireland, Scotland, and England had nurtured generations of rituals, bonfires, lanterns, divination, and quiet ancestral observances. And as these communities settled in the American colonies, they brought these practices not as novelties, but as living threads of cultural identity, quietly woven into the fabric of new settlements. The journey across the Atlantic was arduous, often marked by weeks at sea, cramped quarters, and the uncertainty of arrival in unfamiliar lands. For the emigrants, rituals of the night were comforting markers of continuity, a way to maintain connection to ancestors, landscapes, and seasonal rhythms left far behind. Families would carve turnips and hollowed vegetables, much as they had in Ireland and Scotland, using what was available in their new environment. These simple lanterns offered light not only against the encroaching darkness, but against the alien landscape of a new world, casting familiar shadows and offering reassurance that the old ways could survive across oceans. Communities often clustered in settlements with others from the same regions, reinforcing traditions through shared observances and communal celebrations. In these early American towns and rural homesteads, neighbors would exchange guidance, share lantern designs, and pass down recipes for seasonal treats, small breads or baked goods that echoed the medieval soul cakes of Europe, though adapted to locally available ingredients. The giving of these treats, once tied to prayers for departed souls, became a more generalized gesture of hospitality and shared culture, maintaining the rhythm of generosity embedded in centuries-old custom. The practice of divination also crossed the Atlantic, evolving in subtle ways in response to new social structures. Mirror rituals, apple peelings, and small household games continued, often conducted quietly within families or small groups of friends. These acts preserved the belief that the night of October 31st remained liminal, a moment when the ordinary flow of time and the unseen world could intersect, and when insight into love, fortune, and destiny could be sought without fanfare. Candlelight, flickering shadows, and the quiet hush of attentive observation continued to mark the night as special, just as it had in the misty hills and moonlit lanes of Europe. In towns and settlements, the social aspect of Halloween began to expand. While in the British Isles, much of the observance had been home and hearth-centered, the American colonies offered new opportunities for communal gathering. Seasonal festivals, harvest fairs, and neighborhood walks allowed families to reinforce both social bonds and the protective, symbolic traditions of the night. The lanterns, once carefully placed for guidance of wandering spirits, now became shared sites along streets and lanes, visible to friends and neighbors, creating a network of light that threaded together the physical and symbolic space of a settlement. The merging of old-world traditions with new-world conditions also brought innovation. Pumpkins, more abundant and larger than the turnips previously used, gradually replaced the root vegetables of Europe. This shift was practical, but it also reinforced a sense of adaptation and resilience, showing how customs could endure even as the physical materials of ritual changed. Children learned to carve faces into these new gourds, and the act of crafting lanterns became a shared familial practice, binding generations together through tactile engagement with the traditions of the night. Through these adaptations, Halloween in America retained the core qualities of reflection, preparation, and liminality. Ancestors were remembered, spirits acknowledged, and the rhythms of the season marked. But the night was also enriched by community participation and the novelty of a new landscape. The foggy hills and stone walls of Ireland and Scotland were replaced by forests, fields, and early settlements. Yet the essence of the observance, guidance, protection, insight, and quiet communal ritual remained intact. This transatlantic migration of tradition demonstrates the resilience of cultural memory. The observances of All Hallows' Eve were not imposed upon a new environment. They were reborn, reinterpreted, and woven into the social and physical fabric of the American colonies. What had been private, domestic, and sometimes secret became public, shared, and adaptive, ensuring that Halloween was both recognizable and evolving. In this way, the night of October 31st became a living testament to the continuity of human ritual. Across oceans, generations maintained the rhythm of honoring the unseen, preparing for the turning of the year, and participating in a night that was both protective and exploratory. The old world customs survived not as relics, but as active practices, quietly persistent, subtly transformed, and profoundly meaningful, laying the foundation for the uniquely American evolution of Halloween that would flourish in centuries to come. Victorian parlors and gentle ghost parties. By the 19th century, Halloween had found a new setting, an expression in the parlors of Victorian homes, particularly in Britain and later in North America. Urbanization, industrialization, and a rising middle class had changed the texture of daily life. Families now gathered indoors more frequently. Evenings were spent in candlelit rooms or under the soft glow of gas lamps, and there was a growing appetite for refined, socially oriented entertainments. Halloween, with its roots in liminality and gentle supernatural observance, found fertile ground in these environments, transforming from rustic, rural practices into domestic, socially engaged celebrations. These gatherings were often known as ghost parties. They were not designed to frighten or startle, but to delight and intrigue, blending the mysterious with the convivial. Hosts would invite friends and neighbors into the parlor, where the night's activities centered around storytelling, games, and quiet divination. The room might be decorated with autumnal items, sprigs of holly, bowls of nuts, carved vegetables, or small lanterns, casting warm, shifting light across polished tables and hearths. Every detail reinforced a sense of seasonal transition, a subtle acknowledgement of mortality and the unseen, without the stark terror associated with later horror traditions. Central to these gatherings were seances and attempts to communicate with spirits, reflecting both curiosity and the era's fascination with spiritualism. Mediums, or occasionally clever amateurs, would attempt to bridge the divide between living and dead, sometimes producing faint raps, moving objects, or the soft flicker of candles in response to questions. The events were carefully controlled, often conducted with etiquette and decorum, emphasizing wonder and reflection rather than fear. Participants were encouraged to listen, observe, and interpret, maintaining an air of quiet respect for the invisible world. Storytelling played an equally important role. Guests might take turns recounting tales of ancestral experiences, local legends, or accounts of mysterious occurrences. The stories were often atmospheric rather than sensational, relying on suspense, detail, and a slow unfolding of events rather than loud shocks. A description of a shadow moving across a hallway, the unexplained creak of a floorboard, or the soft tapping of a window pane was sufficient to engage the imagination and invite reflection. In these settings, the supernatural was not monstrous, but subtle, mysterious, and capable of inspiring thoughtful curiosity. Games and predictive activities also persisted, adapted to the parlor environment. Apples were bobbed from bowls of water, nutshells or small tokens were cast to foretell fortune, and mirrors were used in dim candlelight for quiet divination. These acts continued the ancient practices of insight and reflection, allowing individuals to consider love, health, or fate in a playful yet contemplative manner. Each game was an opportunity to engage with tradition, to feel connected to generations past, and to mark the passage of time in a meaningful way. Victorian ghost parties often emphasized social connection, turning what had been solitary or family-centered rituals into shared experiences. Young people could meet and interact in structured ways. Adults could enjoy the artistry of storytelling and ritual, and communities could maintain bonds through collective recognition of the night. The atmosphere was one of refined curiosity, combining aesthetic beauty, intellectual engagement, and spiritual acknowledgement. Candlelight flickered over polished wood, shadows danced across walls, and soft laughter mingled with whispers of speculation about the unseen. Even as industrialization reshaped daily life, Halloween retained its liminal qualities. Guests were aware that the night represented a threshold, a moment to pause, to consider the invisible, and to engage with forces beyond ordinary perception. By shifting the observance indoors and emphasizing shared, gentle experiences, the holiday evolved to reflect both cultural refinement and continuity of ancient tradition. It demonstrated that Halloween need not be terrifying to be meaningful, that the unseen could be honored in quiet, structured ways, and that imagination itself was a conduit for reflection and connection. In Victorian parlors, the soft interplay of light, story, and ritual preserved the essence of Halloween, a night of observation, memory, and subtle interaction with mystery. Families and friends participated together, blending social pleasure with spiritual reflection, maintaining the tradition's deep roots while adapting to the changing rhythms of modern life. These gatherings reinforced the night as a time of gentle enchantment, where the unseen world was acknowledged, stories were shared, and the turning of the seasons was honored in the warmth and intimacy of the hearth. The rise of trick-or-treating. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Halloween in North America began to take on new shapes, blending the ancient customs brought by immigrants with the rhythms of urban life and small-town streets. While much of the early observance had been domestic, contemplative, or ceremonial, the early 1900s saw the emergence of a practice that would eventually define modern Halloween: trick-or-treating. Though in its earliest forms, it was gentle, neighborly, and rooted in tradition rather than spectacle. In towns and villages, streets were lined with modest homes, often with small front gardens, white picket fences, or stone pathways. Children, dressed in simple costumes, sometimes hand-sewn masks, hooded cloaks, or repurposed garments, would move from house to house. These costumes were rarely designed to frighten. They were symbols of transformation, playful disguises that allowed young participants to step briefly into another persona, to embody spirits, tricksters, or liminal figures, and to honor the night's tradition of threshold and disguise. The practice was initially tied closely to older customs of souling and house-to-house visitation from Europe. Children, and occasionally the poor, would knock gently on doors and offer short songs, rhymes, or prayers in exchange for small treats, cakes, nuts, or fruit. This exchange was not commerce, nor was it performative in the modern sense. It was a ritualized acknowledgement of kindness, reciprocity, and community cohesion. The act of giving reinforced neighborhood bonds, creating a quiet rhythm of generosity that connected the living with the spirits of hospitality embedded in centuries of All Hallows' Eve tradition. In many places, the charm of these early streets lay in their soft, communal ambience. Lanterns glowed in windows, candles flickered in pumpkins or other hollowed vegetables, and the sounds of children moving along the paths. Soft laughter, footsteps on cobblestones or dirt, polite greetings, became a gentle soundtrack of the evening. The streets themselves, often lined with trees just beginning to shed their autumn leaves, created a natural canopy of shadow and light, a visual echo of the liminal quality of the night. It was a space both safe and enchanted, where ordinary life paused for a few hours in recognition of seasonal change and communal tradition. Neighbors welcomed the visitors, not as a disruption, but as participants in a shared ritual. Small offerings were placed in bowls on porches or tables, sometimes accompanied by short blessings or good wishes. The giving was deliberate, considered, and symbolic, reinforcing both the moral and social dimensions of the night. Children learned early that politeness, gratitude, and participation were as important as the treats themselves. An education in both social conduct and the ethics of generosity, quietly embedded within the rhythms of the celebration. The emergence of trick-or-treating also reflected urban growth and changing social structures. In densely populated towns, where extended families no longer lived side by side. It became a means of building community networks, connecting children and adults across streets and neighborhoods. It was an inclusive, approachable, and socially reinforcing practice, one that allowed young participants to navigate both public and private spaces with curiosity, attention, and respect. Costumes continued to evolve alongside these practices, incorporating symbols from folklore, literature, and local legend. Children might represent witches, ghosts, harvest spirits, or animals, echoing centuries of belief in liminality and threshold beings. Yet the emphasis was never on terror. Rather, it was on imaginative participation, embodiment of tradition, and the gentle thrill of being seen as something other than oneself for a short evening. Even as towns and cities grew, the essential qualities of Halloween remained intact. Trick-or-treating was not simply about candy. It was a ritual of kindness, observation, and connection, rooted in centuries of spiritual and communal practice. It reflected the human desire to honor thresholds between childhood and adulthood, life and death, the ordinary and the extraordinary, through acts of participation that were simultaneously playful, reflective, and socially meaningful. Through these early streets, lantern-lit windows, and polite exchanges, Halloween became a night of shared experience where young and old, neighbor and visitor could engage with tradition in ways that were meaningful, gentle, and enduring. Trick-or-treating, in its earliest forms, was a testament to the resilience of ritual, the power of community, and the quiet charm of a night that celebrated not fear, but connection, imagination, and the subtle magic of shared human experience. Homemade costumes and vintage Halloween aesthetics. As Halloween continued to take root in the streets and homes of early 20th century towns, the aesthetic of the celebration began to emerge with a distinct charm, shaped by domestic creativity, community values, and the limitations of what could be handcrafted. Costumes, in particular, became a form of expression, imagination, and gentle transformation, reflecting both the individual and the cultural memory carried from European traditions. Children and families made use of what was available: scraps of fabric, old clothing, and simple household materials, to create costumes that were inventive yet modest, elegant in their simplicity. Crepe paper became a common medium, its colors muted under the soft glow of lamplight, twisting into garlands, flowing robes, or accents for masks. Paper masks, carefully cut by hand with scissors, reflected personal creativity. Each one was unique, embodying the imagination of the maker while maintaining the quiet reverence of the night. Families often gathered together to craft these costumes, sharing laughter, stories, and quiet anticipation as the evening approached. Lanterns and lamplight played a central role in the visual atmosphere. Soft golden glows from oil lamps, gaslight fixtures, and small candles placed strategically in windows or along streets lent the night a warm, intimate illumination, transforming ordinary homes into spaces of mystery and quiet enchantment. Shadows flickered gently across walls, and the texture of fabric, paper, and carved gourds became more pronounced in the subdued light, encouraging imaginative perception and a sense of immersion in the evening's rituals. The costumes themselves were symbolic rather than frightening. Children might dress as harvest spirits, animals, folkloric figures, or characters from local tales, embodying aspects of liminality and transformation central to Samhain. Each mask, cloak, or accessory reflected not only practical creativity, but also a continuation of centuries-old ideas about disguise, threshold beings, and gentle interaction with the unseen. The act of dressing up was both play and ritual, a deliberate crossing of boundaries between ordinary identity and temporary persona. Communities took pride in these handcrafted creations. Neighbors might admire each other's ingenuity, children would compare designs, and families would tell stories about the origins or inspiration behind a costume. In this way, The visual aspects of the holiday reinforced the social and educational dimensions of Halloween. Creativity, attentiveness, and subtle moral and spiritual reflection were embedded in the act of participation. The night itself was framed by natural and domestic beauty. Streets lined with trees cast intricate patterns of shadow and leaf. Windows glowed with the soft amber of lamplight, and autumn winds carried faint rustling sounds that complemented the quiet movement of costumed children along sidewalks. This aesthetic continuity, combining natural elements, handcrafted artistry, and gentle illumination, created an atmosphere that was both visually striking and emotionally resonant, allowing participants to engage fully with the liminal qualities of the night. Even treats were presented with care and attention. Candy and small gifts, when handed out, were often placed in decorative containers or accompanied by a soft word of encouragement, maintaining the ritualized, communal spirit that had defined earlier traditions such as souling or early trick-or-treating. Every interaction, from the crafting of a costume to the giving and receiving of treats, reinforced the sense of intentionality and shared human experience, emphasizing presence, connection, and reflection rather than spectacle or fear. Through these early handmade costumes and carefully arranged domestic spaces, Halloween became a night of gentle transformation, communal artistry, and immersive aesthetic experience. Each lantern, mask, and swirl of crepe paper was an active participant in the storytelling of the evening, shaping perception, guiding imagination, and connecting the present to centuries of cultural memory. The soft, golden lamplight, combined with personal creativity and shared tradition, allowed families and communities to honor the night, its liminal magic, and the subtle interplay between the visible and unseen, establishing a visual and emotional language for the holiday that would endure for generations. The influence of Hollywood and radio ghost shows. As the 20th century advanced, Halloween began to interact with emerging forms of media, particularly radio broadcasts and the burgeoning film industry, which brought new dimensions to the way stories were told and experienced. While earlier practices had been rooted in domestic gatherings, street rituals, and communal observances, these technologies introduced a shared, atmospheric form of storytelling that could reach far beyond individual homes, creating a sense of collective imagination and wonder. Radio, becoming increasingly common in households by the 1920s and 1930s, offered a new stage for ghostly tales and suspenseful narratives. Families would gather around the softly glowing set, the hum of the speaker filling the room, as announcers and performers recounted stories of spirits, haunted places, and mysterious occurrences. Unlike modern horror entertainment, these broadcasts emphasized mood, tension, and subtle suggestion rather than overt fright. The power of the medium lay in its ability to spark the imagination. Listeners visualized the story in their minds, filling in details with their own experiences and fears, while remaining safely ensconced in familiar surroundings. Halloween-themed programming was particularly compelling because it tapped into the ancient allure of liminality, the same sense of thresholds and unseen presences that had characterized Samhain for centuries. Tales were often drawn from folklore, local legend, or adapted literature, blending old-world traditions with contemporary cultural motifs. A story of a wandering spirit or a mysterious light in a forest could evoke the same sense of quiet reflection, curiosity, and attentiveness that previous generations had experienced around bonfires, lanterns, or candlelit parlors. Hollywood, meanwhile, began to visualize these narratives, producing films that captured the aesthetic and atmosphere of Halloween. Early cinematic adaptations of ghost stories, gothic tales, and supernatural events relied on lighting, shadows, and music to suggest rather than reveal, cultivating a sense of suspense and wonder. Black and white imagery, flickering candlelight on faces, fog-draped streets, and silhouettes in moonlight created a visual vocabulary for the night. one that reinforced the mystery and liminality inherent in the holiday. These films often drew inspiration from folklore, costume, and domestic rituals, subtly linking the screen to centuries of cultural memory. The interplay between radio and film allowed Halloween to evolve from localized, intimate practice into a shared, mediated cultural experience. A child listening to a ghost story on the radio could later imagine that story enacted on the silver screen. Families could discuss the narrative around the table, embellishing details and connecting the mediated experience to personal and communal traditions. The holiday became both interactive and interpretive, encouraging imagination and reflection while preserving the gentle reverence that had characterized earlier celebrations. At the same time, these media amplified the aesthetic qualities of the night. Lanterns, shadows, costumes, and candlelight, once primarily practical or symbolic, were now also performative, influencing the way individuals perceived space, movement, and presence. A radio story of a distant forest haunted by spirits might cause listeners to notice the flickering shadows of their own rooms more keenly, or to observe the movement of trees outside their windows with renewed awareness. Films emphasized atmosphere, timing, and subtle cues, teaching audiences to appreciate the gradations of light and dark, sound and silence, anticipation and pause. Even as Halloween moved into public consciousness through mass media, the core qualities of the night remained intact. The liminal, reflective, and imaginative aspects of Samhain were preserved. What changed was the scale of participation. Individuals, families, and communities could now experience the same story simultaneously, whether through the static voice of radio or the flickering images on a screen, reinforcing a shared cultural memory and collective imagination. Through Hollywood and radio, the storytelling of Halloween entered a new phase, one that combined ancient ritual, folklore, and domestic practice with modern technology, creating experiences that were immersive, communal, and reflective. The night continued to be a time for observation, imagination, and quiet engagement with the unseen, but now it extended beyond the immediate household, connecting listeners and viewers across distances, and embedding the atmospheric qualities of the holiday in a broader cultural consciousness. In this way, the influence of radio ghost shows and cinematic storytelling did not diminish the intimacy or reflection of Halloween. Rather, it enhanced the holiday's ability to evoke wonder, curiosity, and subtle reverence, allowing ancient sensibilities to thrive in the modern era, and ensuring that the aesthetic, moral, and spiritual dimensions of the night would continue to resonate as the century progressed. Pumpkins, candy companies, and cultural explosion. As the 20th century progressed, Halloween underwent a gradual cultural expansion, shaped by shifting urban landscapes, the rise of consumer goods, and the increasingly social nature of the holiday. While the essence of the night remained rooted in centuries of ritual, imagination, and liminal observance, new elements began to emerge organically, reflecting broader changes in society, technology, and community life. Among these, the most visible was the emergence of pumpkins as the primary medium for lanterns and the gradual integration of packaged treats into the celebration. Pumpkins, abundant in North America and large enough to be carved, offered an ideal canvas for creativity. Unlike the smaller turnips of Ireland and Scotland, they could accommodate expressive designs, glowing faces, and complex patterns. Families quickly embraced pumpkins for both practical and symbolic reasons. They burned slowly when hollowed and lit. They were aesthetically pleasing, and they provided a tactile, participatory activity that connected children and adults alike to the season of harvest. The act of carving became a ritual of craftsmanship, a tactile meditation that reinforced both familial bonds and engagement with the liminal qualities of the night. Alongside pumpkins, the rise of candy companies and pre-packaged sweets introduced a new dimension to Halloween. Early 20th century confections were not the elaborate assortments of modern shelves, but simple candies, chocolates, or small baked goods that could be distributed easily during house-to-house visits. Children's expectation of receiving treats during trick-or-treating encouraged a gentle reinforcement of social exchange, echoing centuries-old customs of souling or offering thanks. The exchange was less about commercialism in the modern sense and more about participation, generosity, and ritualized acknowledgement between householders and visitors. This period also saw Halloween expand geographically and socially, moving beyond immigrant communities and rural traditions into wider urban practice. Small towns and growing cities embraced the holiday, organizing street visits, parades, and community events. Streets were lined with lanterns, houses were decorated with seasonal motifs, and children moved through neighborhoods in handcrafted costumes, often guided by subtle rules of politeness and reciprocity. In these early decades, the holiday emphasized connection, observation, and creativity, maintaining the gentle charm that had defined it for centuries. The combination of pumpkins, costumes, and treats created a multi-sensory experience. The glow of candlelight in carved gourds illuminated streets and homes. Soft shadows played across porches and windows. The crisp autumn air carried the rustle of leaves and the faint laughter of children, and the tactile act of holding candy or carving a design provided both immediacy and memory. Each element reinforced the rhythm and symbolism of the season, linking harvest, preparation for winter, and engagement with both the visible and unseen worlds. The evolution was incremental and cumulative. Families experimented with lantern designs, children improvised costumes, communities coordinated visits, and the availability of small candies made participation easier. What began as modest observances of liminality, protection, and reflection gradually coalesced into a recognizable cultural pattern, an evening in which neighborhoods became shared spaces of imagination, ritual, and social cohesion. The night was no longer solely a domestic or rural observance. It was a cultural rhythm embedded across towns and cities, accessible to all who wished to participate, while retaining the quiet sense of wonder that had defined earlier traditions. Even as production and distribution of candies and pumpkins became more standardized, the practice retained its essential ritual quality. Children continued to carve, dress, and perform small acts of observation and recognition. Families maintained lighting and offerings, and communities preserved the exchange of kindness and acknowledgement. The night remained an interplay of light and shadow, imagination and social connection, participation and reflection, demonstrating that evolution need not erase tradition, but could instead extend its reach while reinforcing its principles. Through these developments, Halloween became a holiday of cultural resonance and continuity, balancing the material and the symbolic, the playful and the contemplative. Pumpkins, handcrafted costumes, and simple treats exemplified the way human creativity adapted to new circumstances, while honoring the season's ancient rhythms. The quiet logic of liminality, observation, and connection persisted, now illuminated by glowing gourds and punctuated by the soft, shared delight of treats, forming a foundation for the modern Halloween we recognize today. A celebration of imagination, community, and enduring ritual. Haunted houses and autumn Americana. As Halloween became more firmly established across North America, the holiday's aesthetic and social rituals continued to expand, reflecting the landscapes, communities, and seasonal rhythms unique to the continent. By the early to mid-20th century, small towns and suburban streets provided the stage for a distinctly American interpretation of Halloween, one that combined playful eeriness with the familiar comfort of autumn routines, communal gatherings, and the harvest season. Among the most enduring traditions to emerge during this period were haunted houses, both temporary and permanent. These were often constructed for school fairs, church events, or local community gatherings, designed not to terrorize, but to engage the imagination and create a shared sense of mystery. Cornstalks, hay bales, carved pumpkins, and carefully arranged shadows created immersive environments, while simple props, swinging lanterns, carefully placed dolls, or soft rustling sounds added depth to the experience. Children and families moved through these spaces with anticipation, curiosity, and delight, observing the careful interplay of light, texture, and sound. Haunted houses functioned as more than entertainment. They were ritualized enactments of liminality, offering a safe space to explore thresholds between ordinary life and the unseen, the mundane and the mysterious. Visitors encountered carefully curated surprises that engaged their attention and imagination, yet always remained grounded in social and moral norms. The experience was communal. Neighbors helped build sets, teenagers assisted younger children through rooms, and families exchanged stories afterward, reinforcing the shared rhythm and cohesion of the celebration. The visual and tactile qualities of autumn contributed strongly to the atmosphere of the night. Leaves, crisp and multicolored, accumulated in piles along paths and sidewalks, inviting play and movement that was both ordinary and symbolic. The sound of footsteps rustling through the foliage, the scent of wood smoke and earth, and the occasional cool breeze reminded participants of the seasonal transition, grounding the holiday in the physical rhythms of nature. Hayrides, pumpkin patches, and school fairs became natural extensions of Halloween, linking the celebration to broader harvest traditions while reinforcing the seasonal magic of observation, reflection, and participation. Community involvement was central to this period. Schools, churches, and civic organizations coordinated events that emphasized inclusion, shared creativity, and safe exploration. Children might engage in scavenger hunts, games, or artistic competitions, while adults maintained lantern-lit pathways, supervised haunted houses, or assisted with refreshments. Each activity carried a dual purpose, fostering social bonds and imaginative participation, while subtly maintaining the holiday's historical roots of reflection, liminality, and respect for unseen presences. The interplay between the eerie and the comforting defined the uniquely American aesthetic of Halloween during this era. Haunted houses, shadowy displays, and costumed children moving along lamplit streets created an atmosphere of mild suspense, yet this was always balanced by the warmth of familiar routines. A cup of cider at a school fair, laughter shared among friends, the soft glow of a home-lit pumpkin, or the comforting touch of a parent guiding a young child through a darkened corridor. The night was thus both thrilling and reassuring, allowing participants to explore the mysterious while remaining connected to community and tradition. Even small-town streets reflected this balance. Houses were decorated with garlands of dried corn, pumpkins, and lanterns, signaling openness to visitors while emphasizing seasonal abundance. Children's costumes ranged from simple homemade creations to imaginative ensembles inspired by folklore, literature, and local stories. Trick-or-treating was often integrated into these walks, with exchanges of candy and small treats reinforcing the ritualized generosity and social cohesion that had characterized Halloween since its earliest forms. Through these practices, Halloween became an immersive cultural landscape. Haunted houses, leaf-strewn streets, school fairs, and seasonal decorations combined to create a multi-layered experience in which imagination, community, and natural rhythms converged. Participants were encouraged to observe carefully, move attentively, and engage playfully with both the seen and unseen, blending aesthetic delight with symbolic reflection. The warmth of human presence, laughter, hospitality, and participation softened the night's eerie edges, ensuring that the holiday remained welcoming, inclusive, and enduringly meaningful. By embedding mystery within comfort, suspense within ritual, and imagination within tangible seasonal cues, Halloween in small-town America evolved into a richly textured celebration, one that honored centuries of tradition while adapting to contemporary landscapes and social structures. The night became not just an event, but an experience, a moment in which light and shadow, play and reflection, fear and delight could coexist harmoniously, offering both children and adults a gentle immersion in the magic of autumn, the rhythm of community, and the enduring presence of cultural memory. Halloween around the world: Mexico, Japan, Ireland, more. While Halloween in North America evolved into a distinctly communal and aesthetic celebration, the roots and variations of the holiday extended far beyond any single region, reflecting a tapestry of spiritual, cultural, and seasonal practices around the globe. Across continents, different communities have historically engaged with the themes of mortality, memory, and liminality, creating observances that, while superficially distinct, share a profound resonance with the ancient principles of Samhain. In Mexico, the holiday of Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead, offers a striking parallel to the spirit of Halloween. Rather than focusing on fright, the celebration emphasizes remembrance, honor, and continuity with ancestors. Families construct altars or ofrendas, adorned with candles, marigolds, food, and personal mementos of the deceased. The soft glow of flickering candles illuminates photographs and offerings, creating spaces that are simultaneously solemn and celebratory. Children participate in this process, helping to arrange items, prepare food, and craft paper decorations, instilling both reverence and imagination. In these rituals, the thin veil between worlds, an idea central to Samhain, is honored through collective memory and ritualized care, emphasizing spiritual beauty rather than fear. In Japan, the modern adaptation of Halloween has taken a different trajectory, blending elements of Western costume tradition with local aesthetic and cultural sensibilities. Public celebrations feature costumes, parades, and communal gatherings, but they often emphasize creativity, artistry, and performance rather than terror or horror. Children and adults alike participate in elaborate displays of ingenuity, exploring transformation through disguise, playful personas, and symbolic expression. Even in urban spaces, the practice maintains an element of liminality, a temporary suspension of ordinary identity, echoing centuries-old understandings of the holiday's reflective and imaginative qualities. Returning to Ireland, the origins of Halloween continue to resonate in local customs, particularly in rural regions where traditional games, storytelling, and community gatherings remain tied to the rhythms of harvest and seasonal change. Pumpkin lanterns illuminate doorways, apples and nuts are used in predictive games, and quiet rituals honor ancestors while providing insight into the future. Even as modern Americanized Halloween has grown in influence, the Irish observances retain a delicate balance of reflection, participation, and seasonal reverence, preserving the spiritual depth that informed the earliest practices. Across Europe, similar traditions can be found, though each carries local inflections. In parts of Spain and Portugal, All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day provide opportunities for families to visit cemeteries, light candles, and place flowers on graves, a practice that emphasizes memory, gratitude, and gentle contemplation. In these moments, the aesthetic qualities of light, shadow, and seasonal landscape are central, echoing the universal human impulse to create spaces where the living and the departed are acknowledged together. Even in regions without formalized Halloween celebrations, the seasonal rhythm of autumn and human reflection on mortality inspire parallel practices. Candles, harvest foods, communal storytelling, and family gatherings mark transitions, create symbolic thresholds, and invite engagement with both natural and spiritual cycles. These practices, while culturally specific, reflect the same underlying human impulses that shaped Samhain: attention to the passage of time, acknowledgement of ancestors, preparation for seasonal change, and the creation of spaces where imagination and memory converge. By comparing these global observances, it becomes clear that Halloween is not merely a singular holiday, but a widespread human phenomenon, one that adapts to local landscapes, spiritual frameworks, and communal structures. Across Mexico, Japan, Ireland, and beyond, participants engage with themes of mortality, transformation, and liminality through practices that are contemplative, imaginative, and socially connective. Candles, lanterns, costumes, altars, and ritualized foods serve as universal markers of attention, care, and participation, allowing each culture to honor the unseen, reflect on the past, and prepare for the rhythms of the future. Ultimately, these global practices highlight the spiritual beauty and depth of Halloween and its related observances, emphasizing reverence, creativity, and reflection rather than sensationalism or fear. Whether through the construction of a marigold-adorned ofrenda in Mexico, the playful artistry of a costume parade in Japan, or the quiet rituals of rural Ireland, the underlying principles remain consistent. Acknowledgement of the thin veil between worlds, connection to ancestors, engagement with community, and mindful observation of seasonal cycles. In this way, Halloween and its cultural relatives across the world reveal a shared human desire to honor life, memory, and the mysteries of existence, a thread that links diverse communities across time and space in a quiet, luminous harmony. The spiritual meaning beneath the celebration. Beneath the costumes, lanterns, and playful mischief of Halloween lies a profound spiritual current, one that has endured across centuries, cultures, and continents. This current is not always obvious, often hidden beneath layers of folklore, aesthetic expression, and communal ritual. Yet it speaks directly to the human experience of mortality, memory, and impermanence. To understand Halloween fully is to look beyond the surface of playful disguises and street festivities, and to perceive the holiday as a deliberate meditation on life's cycles, on the unseen, and on the fleeting nature of existence. From its earliest Celtic origins, Halloween has been intimately connected with the turning of the seasons, the harvest's end, and the approach of winter. The shortening days, the dying of crops, and the falling of leaves were not merely practical markers of time. They were symbols of life's transient nature, reminders that all living things follow rhythms of growth, culmination, and decline. Samhain, the threshold between summer and winter, embodied this awareness, inviting people to honor the past, prepare for the coming darkness, and contemplate the impermanence inherent in all things. The spiritual significance of these seasonal transitions persists in modern Halloween, whether recognized consciously or felt intuitively through the aesthetic and sensory cues of autumn, the rustle of leaves, the scent of earth and wood smoke, and the soft glow of lanterns in the early evening. At the heart of Halloween's spiritual meaning is the relationship between the living and those who have passed. Across cultures, from the Celtic soul cakes to the Mexican ofrendas of Dia de los Muertos, the night provides an opportunity to honor ancestors and departed loved ones. This is not a practice rooted in fear, but in reverence, remembrance, and continuity. The act of acknowledging those who came before fosters a gentle mindfulness of human mortality, reminding participants that life is finite, yet connected through memory, ritual, and communal participation. Each candle, each lantern, each whispered story becomes a small act of acknowledgement, a way to bridge the temporal divide and to integrate reflection on the past into the present. Halloween also invites contemplation of transformation and threshold moments. The wearing of costumes, the movement between home and street, and the traversal of decorated spaces all symbolize a temporary suspension of ordinary identity and routine. In this liminality, participants are invited to explore perspectives beyond their usual experience, to embody roles both imagined and symbolic, and to engage with the unknown in a safe, structured manner. These practices cultivate empathy, imagination, and awareness, providing a spiritual framework for understanding impermanence not as fearsome or final, but as a natural, integrated part of existence. In addition, the holiday encourages conscious engagement with memory and reflection. Games, storytelling, and rituals of fortune or insight prompt participants to look inward, to consider personal and communal histories, and to appreciate the fleeting nature of experience. The practice of sharing stories about ancestors, local legends, or past celebrations links generations, reinforcing a sense of continuity across time. By integrating memory into celebration, Halloween becomes a living meditation on impermanence, encouraging awareness of mortality while simultaneously celebrating life, creativity, and human connection. Even the aesthetic elements of the holiday, carved pumpkins, autumn leaves, candlelight, and handcrafted decorations, serve a spiritual purpose. They are material expressions of impermanence, beautiful, precisely because they are temporary, fading with the night, the season, and the passing of each year. Participants engage with these ephemeral objects, understanding on a subtle level that all things are subject to change, that beauty and joy are transient, and that awareness of this transience can deepen gratitude, presence, and appreciation for life as it unfolds. Ultimately, the spiritual meaning beneath Halloween is a quiet, reflective wisdom. Life is fleeting, death is inevitable, and memory, ritual, and communal connection provide a framework to honor both. The holiday teaches acceptance of impermanence, not with dread, but with curiosity, care, and gentle observation. By engaging with threshold moments, honoring ancestors, celebrating seasonal change, and participating in communal rituals, individuals cultivate a sense of resonance with the rhythms of existence. In this sense, Halloween is both personal and universal, individual and communal. It invites participants to confront mortality with grace, to hold memory tenderly, and to appreciate the temporary yet beautiful nature of life. Beyond the costumes, candy, and playful mischief lies a profound meditation on human existence, a recognition that all things pass, that connections endure through memory and ritual, and that embracing impermanence can lead to deeper empathy, reflection, and spiritual presence. This enduring thread of contemplative practice, embedded in centuries of tradition, makes Halloween not merely a holiday, but a living exercise in spiritual awareness, seasonal attunement, and gentle acceptance of the cycles of life and death. The psychology of why Halloween comforts us. As one reflects on the many layers of Halloween, from its ancient Celtic roots to modern streets lit with jack-o'-lanterns and lined with costumed children, it becomes clear that the holiday has an enduring psychological resonance. The celebration taps into fundamental aspects of the human mind, offering experiences that are simultaneously mysterious and safe, reflective and playful, communal and personal. Understanding why Halloween comforts us requires exploring how liminality, imagination, narrative, and controlled uncertainty interact with our psychology, producing a sense of meaning, belonging, and gentle reassurance. At its core, Halloween thrives on the concept of thresholds, moments and spaces that exist between one state and another. Ancient Samhain rituals mark the transition from summer to winter, the living to the unseen, and life to death. Modern celebrations, though often removed from these explicit spiritual meanings, retain a subtle echo of this structure. Costumes, haunted houses, candle-lit pumpkins, and shadowed streets create temporary liminal spaces where ordinary identity, perception, and expectation are suspended. Psychologically, humans find these thresholds comforting when experienced within a safe, controlled environment. The mind can explore uncertainty and the unknown without being overwhelmed. It is a rehearsal of sorts, a gentle engagement with mystery that stimulates curiosity and imagination while maintaining a sense of security. Another aspect of Halloween's psychological comfort lies in the blending of play and ritual. Dressing up in costumes, moving through leaf-strewn streets, and participating in neighborhood exchanges or haunted attractions provides structured opportunities to experiment with identity, perspective, and creativity. Through role-play, children and adults alike explore aspects of themselves and the world they do not usually encounter. Psychologists note that this type of imaginative engagement promotes emotional flexibility, empathy, and cognitive development, allowing participants to confront fears, moral dilemmas, or abstract concepts in a controlled, playful manner. The temporary embodiment of other personas, spirits, or creatures serves as a psychological rehearsal for navigating uncertainty and complexity, reinforcing confidence and curiosity. The narrative dimension of Halloween is equally significant. Stories, whether shared around Victorian parlors, broadcast over radio, projected on film, or told by neighbors, provide cognitive scaffolding for understanding the unknown. Narratives help organize experience, give structure to uncertainty, and offer patterns through which the mind can process ambiguity. Even ghost stories, haunted house visits, or the ritual of trick-or-treating convey a framework in which mystery is contained, predictable, and ultimately safe. This containment allows the brain to enjoy the thrill of suspense while reinforcing the boundary between danger and safety, imagination and reality. Halloween also comforts through community and shared ritual. Participating in a tradition with others, whether through family, friends, neighbors, or broader cultural engagement, fosters a sense of belonging, collective memory, and social continuity. Humans are wired to find reassurance in the social connection, and Halloween provides an opportunity to explore the unknown within a network of support. The laughter, shared stories, and reciprocal gestures of trick-or-treating or communal celebration signal safety, while simultaneously encouraging exploration of novelty and the extraordinary. This delicate balance between uncertainty and social security is deeply satisfying, reinforcing both trust in others and confidence in oneself. Furthermore, the aesthetic and sensory qualities of the holiday, flickering candlelight, rustling leaves, soft shadows, autumnal scents, and muted sounds, produce a psychological environment that encourages calm attention and reflective awareness. These cues, repeated year after year, create a sense of rhythm, predictability, and continuity, which in turn fosters comfort. Simultaneously, the mild suspense embedded in costumes, playful scares, and symbolic liminality engages the brain's arousal systems, just enough to stimulate excitement and imagination without triggering genuine anxiety. This interplay between mild arousal and safety is a cornerstone of Halloween's enduring psychological appeal. Even culturally, Halloween satisfies a universal human need to confront mortality and impermanence in manageable doses. By symbolically engaging with death, transformation, and the unseen through costumes, lanterns, and ritualized acknowledgement of ancestors, individuals process existential realities in a context that is socially and personally contained. The holiday transforms potentially unsettling truths into playful reflection, aesthetic enjoyment, and gentle meditation, offering reassurance while cultivating mindfulness and presence. In essence, Halloween comforts us because it provides a structured encounter with mystery, impermanence, and imagination, wrapped in communal, aesthetic, and ritual frameworks. It allows the mind to explore thresholds safely, to engage with uncertainty creatively, and to honor the cycles of life without fear. The glow of jack-o'-lanterns, the thrill of narrative suspense, the laughter of costumed neighbors, and the quiet acknowledgement of seasonal transition all converge to create an experience in which mystery itself becomes a source of safety, reflection, and wonder. By understanding the psychological foundations of Halloween, one can see that the holiday's enduring appeal is not merely nostalgia, novelty, or spectacle. but a carefully balanced interplay of curiosity, safety, imagination, and community, offering each participant an opportunity to connect with tradition, themselves, and others, while gently navigating the liminal spaces that define both the night and the human experience. I hope you enjoyed tonight's sleep story, exploring the entire history of Halloween, from its ancient Celtic beginnings and the rituals of Samhain, to the crafting of jack-o'-lanterns, the rise of trick-or-treating, the atmospheric influence of radio and Hollywood, and the quiet spiritual reflections that continue to give the holiday its timeless charm. If you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. Just let your mind wander gently through rustling autumn leaves, flickering candlelight, and the soft glow of lanterns along quiet streets. There's no need to linger on any thoughts now. Let them drift away like wisps of smoke from a softly burning bonfire. And if you'd like to continue your journey into rest, you can always explore more of our peaceful sleep stories. From ancient myths to historical traditions, each one crafted to guide you gently into calm, restorative sleep. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you a quiet, peaceful, and deeply restful night. Sleep well.